Hello and welcome to another Back to Jerusalem podcast. I'm Eugene Bach, your host for this time, and I'm coming to you live on delay from somewhere within the borders of the Philippines this time. I just arrived in the Philippines from China, where I had an amazing time working together with the Underground House Church in a massive metropolitan city. One of the things that I'm seeing is more and more Bible schools are popping up in the most dense areas of China, especially during this time of increased crackdown on Christians. I just sat down with one of my good friends who's a pastor who has a Bible school of 200 Bible students that are ready to leave next year for the mission field. 200. That's just one pastor, not even in a network, just one pastor. And the number of Chinese that are leaving from China to going and serving in other countries is increasing by the day. It is absolutely impossible for me to keep up, or for anyone, for any organization to keep up. I mean, the thing is that I have a network of people that I connect with, that I get my information, that I glean the numbers from when I try to put together data. And it's such weak data. The information that I provide for our listeners is so weak because there's so many people that I don't know, so many people that I don't work with, so many people that are being sent out that I have no clue about them at all. In fact, I continue to meet with people on the road all the time that have been sent out and are participating in Back to Jerusalem Vision. In fact, right now, I have an individual that I have to be very, very careful about how I talk about her. She is serving in Iran today as a Back to Jerusalem missionary. She got saved not through the networks. She was not sent through the networks. She had an individual calling on her life as a Back to Jerusalem missionary. I sat down and asked her, how did you get the Back to Jerusalem vision? How was it so detailed? How did you have such a... She moved to work in Iran, dragging her husband with her. Her husband is a Christian, but not into Back to Jerusalem. Like, he doesn't really know anything about Back to Jerusalem. In fact, the more I talked with her, the more I realized that she knew the vision of Back to Jerusalem and had a heart to give her life. In fact, she moved as a Harvard graduate. She graduated from Harvard. Moved as a Harvard graduate, left from China, could have got an amazing job, and instead moved to serve in the Middle East for Back to Jerusalem, her together with her husband. And when I started asking her about, what's your exposure, I thought maybe, she came from one of the major networks. She didn't. She came from an urban church, unconnected, unaffiliated with the traditional house church networks. Just an individual that feels called and is zealous for the Back to Jerusalem vision. And when I started talking to her, she was so excited because there were so many questions that she had about Back to Jerusalem. And I was so excited because there were so many questions that I had about her and her vision for Back to Jerusalem, her own personal vision for Back to Jerusalem. And so I came from that setting where I spoke at a Bible school in an urban area in China. And I spent the day there. It was absolutely phenomenal. But while I was flying here to the Philippines, where I'm at now, where I'm going to be meeting with more Back to Jerusalem missionaries here in the Philippines, one of the things that I was blown away by is that there was just a meeting this weekend that was hosted in Baku, Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is that little nation sandwiched right between Iran and Georgia and Armenia. It's this little Caucasus region that it stands out because it's mainly Muslim. Azerbaijan is mainly Muslim, and they hosted a climate conference this year. And one of the things that hit me while I was sitting at the airport in Shanghai, reading about the conference that just took place and the gargantuan amount of money that was pledged, it hit me that climate change is being used to support persecution against Christians. climate change is being used to support and prop up governments and dictators that torture their own people and deprive them of human rights. This latest conference, COP29, COP29 as they call it, this latest climate conference was hosted in Baku, Azerbaijan on Saturday. And over the weekend, it really did, in my mind, as I began to read it, I was like, holy cow, this points to a disturbing trend using climate change to fund and help nations that persecute Christians. And if that trend is not disturbing enough, it's even more disturbing in my mind that the people that are being asked to fund these nations that persecute Christians are Christian nations. If you didn't watch, let me just give you a brief breakdown. According to the COP29, which was hosted in Azerbaijan, this climate conference that all of the major nations went to, that was hosted by the United Nations, the majority of the nations that are suffering, according to them, according to this conference, the majority of the nations that are suffering from climate change disasters, such as droughts, floods, storms, all of the major global warming catastrophes, are the nations that persecute Christians. I found that notion interesting right away. That if I start to look at the nations that are saying that they are hurting the most, they are suffering the most, they've been devastated the most from global warming, it's actually those nations that persecute Christians. The overwhelming majority of nations that are guilted into paying the bill for all of these disasters are Christian nations. So listen, this is basically what happened. On Saturday, a bunch of wealthy nations came together, mainly from Western Europe and America, and they pledged to provide $300 billion a year. $300 billion a year. Every year by 2035. And they plan to give this $300 billion a year to countries that quote unquote have increasingly catastrophic impacts of the climate change. So, I don't even know where to begin, because what we have is these elite nations that have basically become elite. They've basically become wealthy because of the way that they govern. Now, I know that you're going to hear a lot of, and I want to play devil's advocate, right? I want to listen to their side. I want to embody their side. When I read these articles and I sit through these conferences online and on YouTube, I try to, the best that I can, to listen to the argument from their perspective. And I try to listen as if I agree. And I try to listen as if they have something to teach me. But I can't help it to hear over and over and over a situation where it's kind of like walking down the streets here in Manila, where I have panhandlers and wealthy people, where wealthy people walk down the street and people that come up and beg for money. I'm hungry. Therefore, give me money. Give me money. I'm hungry. You are not hungry. Therefore, give me money. I look poor. You don't look poor. Therefore, give me money. And listen, when you are approached on the street by someone who's asking for money, it might be or it might not be legitimate. In some cases, you can give money to somebody that has approached you on the street and you're helping the situation. In some cases, you are approached by people on the street and you are feeding the situation. You're making it worse. You're propping it up. You have become a part of the problem by giving money to people on the street that are asking for it. Because sometimes it is a scam. Sometimes mothers and children are forced out by their pimps Human traffickers prey on vulnerable individuals. And vulnerable individuals are used to prey on other vulnerable individuals. When I lived in Kunming, I saw this all the time. In Kunming, they actually had a gang that would take small children and maim them. They would take healthy children, cut off their arms, cut off their legs, so that they would look more pitiful on the street. Put a scooter board under their chest and then push them right out onto the street. And they're covered in dirt and dust and rags, and they're begging you for money. They're holding a cup with their teeth, begging you for money. On a scooter board, begging you for money. What are you going to do? You see that, your heart breaks. Any red-blooded human being is going to want to give to this handicapped individual that is clearly at a disadvantage in life, that is clearly in need of help. And so the knee-jerk reaction is to give. Give money. Give it now. Because that person needs it. And that person needs it now. Not knowing that the very money that you give, 100% of it is taken back to that child's pimp. That child has no choice. That child is enslaved. That child has been maimed. That child has psychological issues because it's being abused emotionally, spiritually, physically, every single day. That child doesn't know any better. You don't know any better. The pimp knows. That is an evil on a level that most people don't want to acknowledge even exists. That's why things like the climate change is very, very difficult for people to deal with. Because on the climate change issue, let's put everything out and have an honest discussion about the climate change issue. Let's say that there are scientists that say that the Earth is warming because of pollutants that human beings are putting into the air. Is that true? I believe, from what I've seen, that there are contributions that humans make to polluting the world around them. And they should stop. I mean, the Bible makes it clear that Christians are to be stewards of the world. That we are to have good stewardship over the planet. That we should leave it in a better situation than we found it. And then there are other scientists that say that the whole climate change issue is blown out of proportion. Now, what people say is that the science is settled. There's a couple of argumentative tactics that are used. One is by showing these Nobel Peace Prize winning individuals. You know, there were Nobel Peace Prize winners that also said that communism and fascism were a good thing. There were Nobel Peace Prize winners that supported the Nazi regime. Were they correct about the Nazi regime just because they were respected scientists or leaders or experts in their field? So the expert witness testimony should carry a little bit of weight. But it's not 100%. Just because an expert says something doesn't mean that you automatically agree. Now, you are going to be shamed to agree with the experts that everybody wants you to agree. And the way that you are shamed is by saying, oh, you're a science denier. Well, first off, I can find experts just like you can find experts. And if I find experts, are you going to give my experts legitimacy, or are you going to then claim democracy over truth? Truth doesn't bend to democracy. No matter how many people vote, if you have 100% of the people that vote on something that's a lie, it doesn't make it more true because 100% of the people believe it. The fact that nobody believes it doesn't make truth any less true. So truth doesn't care about your votes. Truth doesn't care about democracy. Truth doesn't buy into mob rule. Truth doesn't bend just because a lot of people say, oh, this is true, and we all agree that it's true, ergo it must be true. No. So if I can find an expert to compete with your expert, that puts us on even ground. Even if you have more experts that you can find than my experts. And the reverse is true. If I can find more experts than your experts, or better experts than your experts, or more highly educated and decorated experts than your experts, that doesn't make me more true. The other thing is that science is never settled. That's why it's freaking called science. You take an idea, you take a hypothesis, you test it. You take the results, you report the results, and then you test it again. And you test it again from a different angle. And then you test it again from a different angle. And then you test it again from a different angle. Science is never settled. That's why we keep advancing in science, because we never rest on our laurels from what we found, because there's always more to find. Any scientist will tell you that. That's why the more general you are, the more educated you are about a lot of different fields. But the more educated you become, the more detailed you come on a specific field. And you never quite make it to find out everything about one field. You just don't. That's why you can continue to test, question. So anybody that tells you the science is settled is a science denier. That is the very definition of science denying. By saying it doesn't need to be tested anymore, we don't need to hear your opinion anymore, we don't need to weigh the facts anymore, it is settled. That is ignorant. So when we look at the people that came together at this, COP 29 meeting in Azerbaijan, they basically said this: the nations that have created the most pollution have benefited by building up their wealth. I don't agree with that, but I'm going to go along with it. I'm going to accept it. I'm going to accept their premise so that I can walk along with them along their road. I believe that the wealth of nations is built up in many different ways. Creating pollution and robbing other countries only works for a short amount of time. Ask anyone from a Muslim nation. Islam literally went into nations and looted nations in order to make their religion rich. That's how Islam became dominant. Islam started off with Muhammad robbing small caravans, and then from caravans robbing cities, and then from cities robbing kingdoms, and then from kingdoms basically taking over continents. That's how Islam started. And yet when we look at Islamic nations today, they are the panhandlers that are at these climate change conferences begging for money. Doing so while killing and persecuting Christians, then putting on their beggar clothes and going to these conferences asking for Christians, the very people that they persecuted, they are now begging for money. Now, begging is a term that a lot of people will find offensive. So let me use another term that maybe Muslims would be more comfortable with: a jizya. They're basically demanding jizya. And when I say demanding, that's exactly what I mean. When you see these countries that are asking for money, they're actually not asking. It's a little bit charitable of me to talk about them as beggars, because beggar would be a kind word. In fact, they are going there as the poor, as incompetent government organizers, demanding that rich, more powerful nations with militaries that could literally walk over their nations in a day, and they are demanding jizya. Give us money, because today's excuse is climate change. Another day we'll use another excuse, but today's excuse is climate change. You owe us money. Your nation got rich by polluting the world in your breakneck speed of production, throwing pollutants into the atmosphere, polluting the air and the water and the soil. And now the whole world is suffering and the climate is changed, and our nations, which are poor, are now having these catastrophic weather phenomenon, and we don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the wealth to be able to resist or prepare or withstand these catastrophic weather phenomena, because we're not in the position that you are, because we weren't as greedy as you were, and we didn't race at a breakneck speed as you did in order to get wealthy. Does that make sense? That is the argument. That is essentially the argument, that those that used manufacturing, those that used the Industrial Revolution in order to advance their economies, were evil capitalists that polluted the world. And Pakistan, Sudan, Somalia, Iran, Yemen, these countries aren't poor because they didn't adopt the Industrial Revolution. They're not poor because they never adopted free market society. They're not poor because they never adopted democracy. They're poor because they loved the environment and they went the natural way. And they didn't adopt the Industrial Revolution because they saw how it would pollute Mother Earth. This is the crap that I have watched on YouTube for hours and hours and hours so that you wouldn't have to. And this is their argument. And so they are demanding money from Christian nations, mainly Christian nations. You're not getting a dime out of China and India. You're not getting a penny out of Saudi Arabia. It's America, Canada, Australia, Western Europe. These are the nations that they're going after with tenacity. Basically putting these leaders on a bench and whipping them like whipping boys. Saying that you've been bad. You have been greedy. Now you need to give some of your money to us. Because we weren't bad. We weren't greedy. And how do you know? Because we're poor. Evidence shows that we are poor, and our poor makes us good. They're not the minorities, by the way. They're not the minorities. They are the majority. The majority of the world is not America and Europe. The majority of the world in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. That is the majority of the world. 2/3 of the world's population is in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. So 2/3 of the world's population is demanding that a 1/4 or smaller of the world's population give them money. Why? Because they got it dishonestly. They got it by colonialism. And colonialism led to wealth that poured into the revolution for the economies that people saw through in the Industrial Revolution. And then the Industrial Revolution led to more military power. And that more military power led to dominance, where poor countries were taken advantage of while wealthy countries got fat and lazy and polluted the world, and now everybody else is suffering. So, if it is agreed that there is a climate crisis, so let's all get on board and just admit. So whether you feel that there's a climate crisis or there's not, doesn't matter. For the purpose of this discussion, just agree that there is. Agree with them. So if you agree that there's a climate crisis, then you must come to the conclusion that it is a shared crisis by everyone. And it doesn't matter whether you are from Canada or Timbuktu. It doesn't matter whether you are from Paris or from Beijing. We all live under the same sky. We all suffer the same impact of climate change and this increase of catastrophes. Yet, The climate crusaders argue that rich countries cause the problem, but it's poor countries who suffer the most. Well, if it's a climate crisis, don't we all suffer equally? Aha. No, this is where the tables change. We don't all suffer equally. Why? Because poor countries suffer more. Why? Well, at the conference, they say that they suffer more because they don't have the infrastructure. Why don't you have the infrastructure? Because they're poor. And why are they poor? Because wealthy nations stole from them and need to give back. This is the heart of the lie. The truth is, and here's the truth. Sorry it took me this long to get to the heart of the matter, almost a half an hour in. But the truth is this. The overwhelming majority of the poor nations that stand to receive money from climate change are run by dictators and horrible governments. And the reason why those nations can't stand up to basic climate, we're not even talking about climate change. We're not talking about catastrophes. We're not talking about your flood seasons and your typhoons and your earthquakes. We're talking about, because the West suffers those as well. Guys, the U.S. was just hit by a massive typhoon. Devastated most of North Carolina. Within a stinking 14-day period, I was speaking at churches in that region. Were they hit hard? Yes. Did people lose everything? Yes. Will they still be poor 5 years from now? My guessing is they won't be poor 5 months from now. Yes, they will be recovering. Yes, there will be some things lost, but there will be a rebuilding process that you don't see in the poor nations. Why? Because the government fails the people. And those governments need to fail so that they can be changed by the people. But they won't fail. Failing governments won't fail because climate change initiatives like the one that just took place in Azerbaijan uses money to prop them up. Meaning that bad governments last longer. Misery is extended. The help is actually delayed. The climate change initiatives hurt poor people. And more than anything, help nations that persecute Christians. That's the heart of the lie. The people in these nations are not suffering from climate change. They're suffering from evil regimes. The truth is, the overwhelming majority of the money that is going to go out is going to be distributed among nations that have horrible human rights abuses, including taking rights away from women, allowing fathers to leave women and take the children, not allowing women to flee from environments where they're being raped, selling small children. One of the recipients that will be receiving a lot of these funding is going to be Iraq, who is passing a law right now for 9-year-old girls to be married off to older men. The people in these nations are not suffering from climate change. They're suffering from evil regimes. And these evil regimes deprive their people of basic human rights. At the same time, they embezzle all of the nation's resources for themselves. We see that with Hamas. When we look at Hamas in Palestine, one of the problems with Hamas is that all their top leaders, we've seen billions of dollars go to Palestine, billions. And the money was not given to the people. The people are still in the same poor, wretched situation that they were before. The leaders, however, have left and are living high on the hog, are staying in multi-million-dollar suites, apartments, houses, driving Ferraris, Lamborghinis, wearing Gucci and Louis Vuitton. Keep giving money. They will guilt you all day on that one. That's a different guilt trip. That one's not climate change. That's a different guilt trip. But what happens is that these evil regimes that go and attack free people, free society, They go and they grip their claws into the people like they did in Iran, where now the Iranian people have no choice. The Ayatollahs rule with an iron fist. The people are not able to get rid of the leadership, not without bloodshed. The people cannot get rid of the Hamas leaders, not without bloodshed. Israel is actually helping Gaza get rid of Hamas. And so now we see that when you give these regimes money, not only do they use the wealth of their people and embezzle the wealth of their people while their people live in misery, they also take wealth from other nations to help them stay in power. Look this up. Just do me a favor. Look this up. How many details of the money that is supposed to be used, of the $300 billion that the Christian nations have basically pledged, mainly Christian nations. I'm sure you can go to the charts and you can find non-Christian nations like Japan that are also donating. Congratulations. I will give you those. But the overwhelming majority, suck it up. They're Christian. So the overwhelming number of nations that are giving to this $300 billion a year are going to be Christian nations. Look it up. Let me ask you one simple question. 300 billion is a lot of money. A lot of money. How is it going to be used? Where is that money going? And how? If you don't know where it's going, then how is it helping the environment? What is the return on the investment? Is anything promised? The answer, no. Tyrannical governments are demanding that Christian nations give them money. Now, the 300 billion is not enough. You know, there are leaders that actually got up and walked out of the meeting in Azerbaijan because they thought it was an insult. $300 billion was an insult to them. They're demanding at least 1.3 trillion just to start, as a starting number. 300 billion is below the ground level negotiations. Beneath nations like India. India felt that it was an insult to go beneath the ground of the negotiation, which is 1.3 trillion. So the tyrannical governments, and they're not asking, they're demanding Christian nations give $1.3 trillion. According to the United Nations, the nation hit the hardest by climate disaster. This is according to the United Nations. So the nation hit the hardest by climate disaster is, drumroll please, Somalia. Guys, 2 weeks ago, I was with a pastor in Africa from Somalia. And according to him, there are less than 100 Christians in the entire nation. If anybody, according to him, if anybody's known to be a Christian, they would be slaughtered. And now the Muslim nation of Somalia is demanding from Christian nations around the world to give them money to prop up their regime, to support their tyrannical efforts to persecute Christians. And Christian nations are doing it. This month, Somalia was named as one of the 2 nations to receive $134 million for climate change initiatives. Do you think that $134 million is going to make a bit of difference in Somalia? Do you know who's going to get that money? And we've just learned to accept it as Christians. I'm not talking about as nations. I'm not talking about if you're European or American. I'm saying as Christians, this should be unacceptable to us. That $134 million that is supposed to be given to Somalia is supposed to be split with Iraq. So Iraq and Somalia should split this money. I promise you, the money will not do one single thing in Iraq or Somalia to help climate change, but it will help those regimes stay in power a little longer. It will help those regimes that persecute Christians stay in power a little longer. It will help those regimes that help older men shop for 9-year-old girls stay in power a little longer. In Sudan, the nation that Miriam Ibrahim, we wrote her book in a book called Shackled. If you haven't read that yet, it's a phenomenal book. In Sudan, the nation that held the young mother, Miriam Ibrahim, in prison, shackled her with her infant son while pregnant, beat her while she was pregnant, and gave birth in prison while shackled on the dirt floor outside while being tortured, and had to go through female genital mutilation after the birth of her child. Sudan did it because she was a Christian. And they want Christians to give a whopping $8.4 billion. That's almost $1 billion per year in the next 10 years. $8.4 billion. Sudan is demanding that Christian nations pay them for the climate change catastrophes that they must endure. And what are those catastrophes? Droughts, no water, massive rainstorms. Yes, the same argument is made. These wild, catastrophic weather changes are the result of climate change, according to this dogma. Therefore, the nations that have droughts and floods in the same year are saying that we don't have the infrastructure to stop the floods, and we don't have the infrastructure to help people from dying during droughts. I would think that one could be planned to help the other, but that's just me. And that it's in a place where governments are functional, and where governments are not functional is in Islamic Sudan, where Christians are persecuted, and they want Christians to give $1 billion per year for the next 10 years. Do you think that will make a lick of difference in Sudan? North Korea is also at the table, and they've been approved for $752,000 to fight climate change. Iran has been approved, the nation that has a ton of oil, $1.4 million. Both of these nations kill Christians, and Christian nations want to give them more money to do it better, longer, more efficient. You know, India right now is number 11 when it comes to the nations of the world with the most persecution against Christians. Number 11. India is the top recipient of these funds with $5.1 billion right now in proposals. Pakistan, we just did a book this year that just came out about Shagufta Kausar, an amazing story. Her story covered in her biography is about how Pakistan, the government of Pakistan, wanted her to deny her faith in Christ. And she refused. And as a result, she was put on death row. A Christian, mother of 4, on death row. In her biography that just came out in June called Under the Threat of Death, it's available now. You can go online and get that book. You can read about how the government charged her for sending a text message that was unfavorable about Muhammad. She sent one text message that was unfavorable about Muhammad. And this mother of 4 was put on death row. She was told, you can get off death row. All you have to do is deny your faith in Christ. And she refused to. Therefore, she was sentenced to death for a text message. It gets better or worse, however you want to look at it. The text message was sent in English. Shagufta doesn't speak English. But it gets better. Shagufta only speaks Urdu, the language of Pakistan. The text message wasn't sent in Urdu, it was sent in English. But even if it was sent in Urdu, Shagufta doesn't know how to read or write. But it gets better. Because even if she was able to find a way to send a message in a language that she doesn't know, with a system that she isn't, that she's illiterate, so she can't do, she also has never owned a mobile phone. So it was impossible for her to send a text message with a phone that she's never owned, never bought, a SIM card that wasn't registered in her name, and a phone that she's never owned because she was too poor. She was a janitor at a school in Pakistan. She didn't have the money to buy a phone, ever. A mother of 4 with a handicapped husband. But all of that would be cleared up at trial, certainly. She wasn't allowed to attend her own trial where she was sentenced to death. She spent 8 years in solitary confinement on death row as a Christian because she refused to deny her faith. That nation, Pakistan, stands to receive a huge amount, up to $14 billion from the world. I read through, Pakistan has been involved in the climate change initiatives since 2015. That's 9 years ago. So I went back through the Paris Climate Accord. The Paris Climate Accord, there I read from the initiatives and the people that made their pledges. And Pakistan was one of the people that made their pledges. Now, there were a lot of things that I read in the pledge of Pakistan. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. Basically, what Pakistan pledged, no joke, their pledge was to at some point in the future reach a peak of their carbon emissions and reduce it after they reach their peak. That's no joke. China did the same. China basically said, listen, we will sign on to the Paris Accord. Everybody was praised for getting China and India to sign the Paris Agreement, the Paris Accord agreement. Do you know what China was praised for? Literally, their efforts were to go gangbusters and whatever they did between the signing of the Paris Climate Accord up until 2030, they could do whatever they wanted. But the idea was that by 2030, they would have reached their peak. So that actually gives you the initiative to increase and belch out all of the carbon emissions that you can possibly do by 2030. That way, everything that you do after 2030 looks like you're reducing your emissions. That's what China promised to do. They promised to reach their peak by 2030, which basically means whatever we're going to do by 2030. Which means even if they don't plan to do it, a smart planner, which China is, would just increase and belch out as much as they could, inflate their numbers to show how much they've done, and then after 2030, slowly decrease, which is no decrease at all. It's actually still an increase from when the Paris Climate Agreement was first signed. I'm kind of reminded of what I just saw with a politician from New York. The governor of New York just talked about how she saved the people by she had an initiative on her desk to basically raise the tunnel fees. Now, I won't get it right, but I'll guess, I'll say around. The tunnel fees were to increase by $15. And she said, no way. The people cannot afford $15. So she came out and told the people, I stood strong and I saved the normal people so much money by only increasing to $9. That's a savings of $6. You save $6 per day or per entry going in and out of the city because I didn't increase it to 15. Yeah, but you still increased it. Yeah, but I could have increased it more. Well, if I use your logic, why stop at 15? Why not say, I saved the people $1 billion. I had a proposal on my desk that said that everybody coming and going through the Lincoln Tunnel into New York City would have to pay $1 billion. But I said no. No. You would only have to pay $9. I literally saved you $999 million. You can do the math, whatever it is that you saved. And then you would have been an even bigger hero. You didn't save anybody. You just made your increase sound better by basically threatening people, telling people what you could have increased it to. That's what China does. China basically says this is what we're capable of doing, and we'll do what we're capable of by 2030. And then we'll start to mark it down. But then by 2030, we can actually renegotiate this whole deal. So they agreed to nothing in the Paris Accord. You know what India pledged? India pledged to stop the intensity of their increase for carbon emissions. Not to decrease their carbon emissions, to decrease the intensity of their increase, which is basically the New York tunnel thing that I just told you. It's the same analogy. Christian nations are being duped into giving money to tyrannical governments that persecute Christians. And I think we need to stop. I want to thank you so much for joining us for another Back to Jerusalem podcast. Again, I'm Eugene Bach, your host for this time, coming to you live on delay from somewhere within the borders of the Philippines. God bless you.